Hey there, self-care warriors. Welcome back to Self-Care Haven. Today we're going to do a video on gaslighting. I wrote an in-depth article last year called 50 Shades of Gaslighting, and I'm going to be sharing some important excerpts from this article. Because it's so long and in-depth, I'm not going to be reading out loud the entire article, but I do want to go over some main points from the article that might help you if you suspect that you have been the victim of gaslighting, if you are still struggling with the effects of gaslighting, which can include both emotional and physical effects, because we do tend to become exhausted when we have our reality warped by another person, especially a predatory individual like a narcissist, a malignant narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath. And I'm going to be offering a few tips and tools so that you can overcome some of the effects of gaslighting. So let's get started. What is gaslighting? The term gaslighting first originated in Patrick Hamilton's 1938 play Gaslight, in which a manipulative husband drives his wife to the brink of insanity by causing her to question her own reality. It was also popularized in the 1944 film adaptation Gaslight, a psychological thriller about a man named Gregory Anton who murders a famous opera singer and later marries her niece Paula to gain access to the rest of her family jewels. Gregory erodes his new wife's sense of reality by making her believe that her aunt's house is haunted in the hopes that she will be institutionalized. He does everything from rearranging items in the house, flickering gaslights off and on, to making noises in the attic so she feels as if she's becoming increasingly unhinged. He isolates her so that she is unable to seek support for the terror that she is experiencing. The real kicker? After manufacturing these crazy-making scenarios, he then convinces her that all of these events are a figment of her imagination. Gaslighting has become a well-known term in the abuse survivor community, particularly for survivors of malignant narcissists. Unlike more vulnerable narcissists, who may possess more of a capacity for remorse, malignant narcissists truly believe in their superiority, they are grandiose, and they lie on the higher end of the narcissistic spectrum. They have antisocial traits, they might demonstrate paranoia, they have an excessive sense of entitlement, they show callous lack of empathy, and they display an egregious liking for interpersonal exploitation. Gaslighting provides malignant narcissists with a portal to erase the reality of their victims without a trace. It is a method that enables them to commit covert psychological murder with clean hands. Is gaslighting intentional? One might wonder, is all gaslighting intentional? After all, we've all had experiences where we've inadvertently invalidated someone else's experience without meaning to. Maybe we lacked enough information about the matter, maybe we were defensive about being right, or we just didn't agree with the interpretation of events. What Dr. Sherman calls everyday gaslighting may occur due to human error, but it does not negate the danger of gaslighting when it is used to emotionally terrorize someone. In the context of an abusive relationship, gaslighting is used to deliberately undercut the victim's reality and make him or her malleable to mistreatment. As Dr. Sarkis writes in her article, are gaslighters aware of what they do? Not all gaslighters engage in it intentionally, but those who are cult leaders, dictators, and malignant narcissists in relationships most certainly do so with an agenda in mind. As she writes, the goal is to make the victim or victims question their own reality and depend on the gaslighter. In the case of a person with a personality disorder, such as an antisocial personality disorder, they are born with an insatiable need to control others. Gaslighting allows perpetrators to evade accountability for their actions, to deflect responsibility, and exercise their control over their partners with alarming ease. Beliefs, after all, are immensely powerful. They have the power to create division, build or destroy nations, and or start wars. To mold the beliefs of an unsuspecting target to suit your own agendas is to essentially control their behavior and even potentially change their life course trajectory. If narcissistic Calvin, for example, decides he wants to wreak havoc over his girlfriend Brianna's reality, all he has to do is convince her that she cannot trust herself or her instincts or her experiences, especially about the abuse that she's experiencing. How does gaslighting unfold? As Dr. Robin Stern notes in her book, The Gaslight Effect results from a relationship between two people. A gaslighter who needs to be right in order to preserve his or her own sense of self and his sense of having power in the world, and a gaslightee who allows the gaslighter to define his or her sense of reality because she idealizes the gaslighter and seeks his or her approval. It is in the victim seeking validation and approval from the gaslighter that danger begins to unfold. Gaslighting is essentially psychological warfare, causing a victim to habitually question himself or herself. It is employed as a power play to regain control over the victim's psyche, sense of stability, and sense of self. By playing puppeteer to the survivor's perceptions, the manipulator is able to pull the strings in every context where his or her target feels powerless, confused, disoriented, on edge, perpetually walking on eggshells to keep the peace. What gaslighting looks like. An example. Imagine this scenario. Diana and Robert. Now, in this scenario, the gaslighter is going to be male, but of course a gaslighter can be female or male. There's of course male and female narcissists. I just want to mention that in case you're wondering why in this example the narcissist happens to be male. Diana and Robert have been dating for several months. Diana thinks she's met the one. Robert is generous, he's kind, he's supportive, he's funny. They become enamored with each other quickly and move in together shortly after their 1-year anniversary. As soon as Diana signs the lease on their new apartment, however, it is evident that there's some trouble in paradise. Robert's usual warmth and affection begins to wane. After several months, Diana notices that he has become inexplicably cold and withdrawn. He lashes out more often, creates nonsensical arguments in which he uses Diana as a scapegoat for every issue, blame shifting, and criticizes her on a daily basis. Sound familiar? It's a cycle of narcissistic abuse. It's almost as if he's undergone a personality transplant from the once charming and down-to-earth man she thought she knew. He has also stopped paying his half of the rent, claiming that he's been struggling financially ever since the move. Though Diana remembers him enthusiastically choosing the neighborhood where they currently live, he now complains it is far too expensive for his taste and accuses her of being too extravagant. She notices he has more than enough funds and money to spend on drinking with his friends or gambling late into the night, but grudgingly she agrees to pay his half until he gets back on his feet. Diana recognizes that Robert is not only taking her for granted, but he's taking advantage of her. When she finally confronts him one night as he stumbles into the apartment at an obscenely late hour, his response is rageful and defensive. He accuses her of not trusting him, of being oversensitive. He calls her horrible names. He threatens to leave and never come back. He refuses to speak with her at all about his behavior, denies that he's come home late, and ends up going to a friend's place, leaving Diana in tears and filled with anxiety about his whereabouts. In the midst of her despair, she begins to wonder if she's been too hard on him. She calls him multiple times, begging for him to come back and apologizing profusely for the things she's accused him of. He does come back, but the cycle only begins again. After only a few blissful days of making up, where Robert graciously forgives Diana for her overreactions, Robert begins disappearing during the nights and reappearing with a suspiciously unkempt appearance. He also receives mysterious calls at odd hours, which he takes privately in the bathroom with the door locked. Each time Diana tries to raise questions about where he's been and whether he's been seeing other women behind her back, he pushes back, accusing her of being crazy, needy, and paranoid. He says that she's imagining things. Despite her attempts to uncover the truth, she starts to wonder if she really is being paranoid, if she really isn't misinterpreting things. Maybe it is really her fault that he's distancing himself. Maybe she really is overreacting. Maybe he just needs time to unwind. She begins avoiding confrontation with Robert altogether and instead tries her best to please him instead, doubling her efforts to show him more affection and understanding. Her hope is that once he realizes what a great partner she is, he will stop his shady behavior and go back to being the man he presented himself to be in the beginning. Unfortunately, as most victims ensnared in the vicious cycle of emotional abuse and psychological abuse know, this is rarely the case. This is just the beginning. Why does gaslighting work so well? Diana and Robert's story illustrate a classic example of the cycle of narcissistic abuse. one in which idealization is followed by devaluation, and the honeymoon phase dissipates into the unmasking of a covert predator and manipulator. Robert is able to gaslight Diana into believing that she is the problem, all while she financially supports him and doubles her efforts to be a more loving partner. Meanwhile, he engages in infidelity, which he denies, verbally berates her, warps her reality, and subjects her to bouts of narcissistic rage, all without any consequences for his actions or accountability. This isn't at all the healthy, loving relationship that Diana signed up for, or thought she was signing up for. But the powerful effect of gaslighting is that Robert's version of reality, Diana's crazy, he's the one having to put up with her overreaction, her oversensitivity, her paranoia, replaces the actual reality of what's going on, replaces the truth. Do you see what's wrong with this picture? Gaslighting lets the perpetrator off the hook while the victim is left picking up the pieces and then some. Why do survivors believe in gaslighters? Executed effectively and done chronically, gaslighting causes self-doubt and cognitive dissonance, a state of turmoil stirred by inconsistent attitudes and beliefs. Survivors of emotional predators sense that something is amiss, but when they attempt to address it to the perpetrator, they are often blindsided by their abuser's complete dismissal and invalidation of their reality. Diana knew that something was wrong and felt like she was being taken advantage of when Robert stopped paying his half of the rent and began coming home at late hours. But after being on the receiving end of his gaslighting and verbal abuse, she rationalized that her behavior must have caused the conflict. She did not want to lose out on the emotional investment in what appeared to be a great relationship in the beginning. She didn't want to miss out on the fantasy relationship. As a result, she instead invested more of her efforts, unfortunately risking the loss of her own sense of self. Gaslighting, after all, begins insidiously in stages. In the first stage, survivors still have a grasp of their perceptions, even if they may not understand what's happening. Like a frog in slowly boiling water, however, they become accustomed to the insidious warping of their reality until they no longer recognize their reality or even themselves. Initially, like Diana, they may attempt to reiterate their perspective and express disbelief at the gaslighter's claims. As gaslighting continues, however, it wears down the victim. Diana eventually tries to win Robert back because she feels unable to self-validate after his constant verbal attacks and rageful responses. This is not uncommon for victims of chronic gaslighting, especially when a repetition or reinforcement of false claims is involved. According to Lynn Hasher, a psychologist at the University of Toronto, repetition makes things seem plausible, and the effect is likely more powerful when people are tired or distracted by other information. Chronic gaslighting eventually leads to pure exhaustion. Victims develop a sense of learned helplessness as they are met with this intense consistency of denial, rage, projection, or accusations of the gaslighter. They start to depend on the gaslighter's reality as a source of truth because they don't believe in their own reality. Exhaustion from abuse and retaliation for asserting oneself creates a mental fog of epic proportions, one in which a survivor can easily drown in even the most ridiculous excuses, as long as they carry a grain of truth. Now, gaslighters might use this technique where they put a nugget of truth in whatever they're saying just to make you doubt yourself, right? So let's say that you end up finding out that the manipulator that you're dating has a main partner, a boyfriend or girlfriend. They deny it, but they try to put a nugget of truth. Maybe they say that, oh, I did have a boyfriend or girlfriend, but we're separated right now. Or they might say, we just recently got back together right after you and I started dating. So there's all sorts of ways in which they can put this nugget of truth just to make you feel like maybe they are telling the truth. Maybe I am losing my mind. Maybe this person is telling me what's going on. But in reality, what's happening is that they've taken that grain of truth and they've used it to create this self-doubt within you so that you're no longer able to be grounded in your own reality. The survivor of a conniving gaslighter becomes submerged in confusion about what actually occurred and whether anything truly occurred at all. So instead of questioning the gaslighter, they attempt to prevent further psychological assault by feeding their own self-doubt and uncertainty surrounding the abuse that is occurring. Dr. George Simon, who specializes in the character disorder, writes, Gaslighting victims question their judgment. They can even come to question their very sanity. Crafty, covert aggressors know how to make you doubt. In your gut, you feel like they're trying to play you, but they can have you feeling like you're a fool for thinking so. They can even have you questioning what's real and what isn't. To summarize, why does gaslighting work? There are more than a few reasons. First of all, gaslighting exploits any existing self-doubt about one's capabilities as well as any past traumas that may cause the victim to feel too damaged to see reality clearly. So if you have been the victim of previous abuse, it's also a little bit easier for a gaslighter to get inside of your head because you've been there before. And there are holes in your confidence about the ability to perceive reality clearly because you've been gaslighted your entire life. Gaslighting exhausts a victim's internal resources, right? So that they're unable to self-validate and they start to depend on the abuser for validation. And they eventually give into this sense of learned helplessness. Gaslighting depletes individuals of a stable sense of self-worth and certainty about how they interpret and perceive the world. Gaslighting manufactures insecurities and fears that never existed in the first place, causing the victim to focus on his or her perceived flaws rather than the abuser's transgressions. This is all about the blame shifting that Robert put Diana through. He kept telling her that she was paranoid, that she was being clingy and needy and oversensitive, right? So she is forced to look at herself rather than looking outward and looking at the source of her agitation. Gaslighting causes the survivor to investigate whether he or she has done something wrong instead of looking at the perpetrator's behavior as the cause of concern. Gaslighting sets up survivors to fail no matter what they do. Abusers will demonstrate disapproval regardless of how hard the survivor tries to win over the abuser's approval. Whether victims stay silent and compliant or aggressive and assertive, they will be punished by the gaslighter. By moving the goalposts constantly, the perpetrator is able to shift their expectations and their claims at the top of a hat. Gaslighting diverts from, denies, rationalizes, and minimizes horrific acts of psychological and physical violence. Gaslighting creates a dangerous form of retaliation for victims speaking out, because each time they do, they are met with a psychological or even physical assault that causes them to feel increasingly diminished. There are a few ways that gaslighting can manifest in these relationships. I'll go over them very quickly, but they're explored very in-depth in the article. The first one is denial and dismissal. This is when the gaslighter outright denies the fact that they did something that they really did. And much like reasonable doubt can sway a jury, continually denying a victim's experiences can lead the victim in search of evidence that confirms the abuser's reality rather than their own. They're trying to resolve that cognitive dissonance. And then another one is shaming and emotional invalidation. This is when abusers are unable to convince you that your truth is a false reality because you have all the documentation, all the proof and verification. They want to add this extra dose of emotional anesthesia to keep you quiet and compliant about their transgressions. So they're going to introduce this subtle shaming or emotional invalidation. This is when not only are your claims dismissed and denied, but the fact that you brought them up in the first place makes you the abnormal, defective, or incompetent one, right? They might say something like, I can't believe you would think that of me, you have serious trust issues. Or they might say, why are you bringing up the past? You're so focused on the past, you really can't let go of things. I'm so angry you're bringing this up. The sexual predator might shame you by saying, well, why were you wearing that short skirt? Why were you so drunk? Why were you this? Why did you come back to my place if you didn't want to have sex? You know, there's all sorts of ways in which shaming can take place. And this kind of shaming causes you to look at yourself and causes you to look internally rather than externally at the perpetrator. And shaming is also powerful because it taps into those deep wounds of childhood, right? When we're shamed for doing something, we regress back to that child who was shamed by their narcissistic parent or shamed by the bullies that cornered them. So it's really important to recognize when we're being shamed and how that's affecting our ability to ground ourselves in our own reality. Another technique they use, which I've talked about in previous videos, is pathologizing the victim, right? Malignant narcissists can take it one step further when they pathologize and discredit their partners as crazy or insane. They play the smirking doctors in their intimate relationships, diagnosing their victims like unruly patients, all while downplaying their own pathological behavior. And a victim whose credibility is weakened serves as ammunition for the abuser because the abuser is able to evade accountability for his or her actions by claiming that the victim is an unhinged, unstable, pursuing some sort of vendetta against the abuser. Maybe they even claim that you're on drugs. Maybe they even give you drugs. The National Domestic Violence Hotline found that around 89% of their callers have experienced some form of mental health coercion, and that 43% had experienced a substance abuse coercion from their abuser. That means that most survivors who reported their abusive partners had actively contributed to mental health difficulties or their use of substances, and their partners threatened to use those difficulties or substance abuse against them with important authorities such as legal or child custody professionals to prevent them from obtaining custody or other things that they wanted or needed. This is from the National Domestic Violence Hotline, guys. So imagine if this is from reports of overt abuse. Imagine what happens in covert abuse, right? Covert abusers are the most dangerous and insidious because they can drive you to suicide. I'm not kidding with this. This has happened a number of times. This has probably happened more than we know, and there have been cases where survivors of covert abuse by narcissists have committed suicide, have been driven over the edge, and unfortunately there is very little legal justice for them. I mean, there was that one case that happened recently with a girlfriend who drove her boyfriend into suicide, and she was actually sentenced. But that is one of those rare cases where justice was actually served. In many cases, the suicide is still looked as the fault of the person who committed suicide, and the person who has been abused and has been chronically abused, and the abuser is never held accountable. So these types of covert abusers actually contribute to the mental health difficulties of their partners, and they even introduce substance use into the relationship just so that they can tell the authorities, hey, my partner is abusing these drugs. And you know, they might even be drugging them secretly, and the partners may not even know about it, right? So we have movies like, for example, Girl on the Train, a very classic case of gaslighting, where the husband, he's the person behind all of this. He's the person behind her difficulties, and he's the person who is causing her to do these things, and he's warping her reality. The most covert gaslighters manufacture scenarios that drive their victims over the edge while erasing any trace of their involvement. They exploit existing vulnerabilities in the victim, such as past traumas, addictions, and mental health issues. They create chaos so that the victim reacts, and they're able to use the reactions of their victims against them, sometimes even going so far as to videotape their reactions while failing to provide the context for their abusive behavior. And this is a quote from my book, Power: Surviving and Thriving After Narcissistic Abuse. Narcissists magnify the gaslighting effect when they accuse their victims of requiring professional help, medication, or psychiatric evaluation when their victims begin to call out the abuse. They may even coerce their victims to take drugs or push them over the edge when their victims are feeling suicidal from the impact of the long-term psychological terrorism they've endured. This is all done with the dual purpose of gaslighting the victim into thinking he or she is the crazy one, and of gaslighting society into thinking that they, the abuser, is actually the victim instead. So they use the vulnerabilities or past traumas disclosed to them by the victims in order to re-traumatize them, in order to further gaslight and shame them. Whenever they try to expose the abuser, they might accuse the victims of being bitter or obsessed with them, when in fact they're the ones who are stalking the victims, of course. And not unlike the setup in movies like Gaslight, the victim finds himself or herself being told that they're crazy, they're losing it, imagining things, they're delusional, even after they endure blow after blow. As victims of psychological violence get closer to the precipice of truth, the man or woman behind the curtain creates a great deal of noise to divert their victims from ever seeing what is beneath the surface of their facade and their grandiose claims of authenticity. The noise that malignant narcissists create instead refocuses on attacking the credibility of the victim rather than addressing their own crimes. An expert gaslighter will point out the fact that you were violated in the past, which must be why you're acting out your trauma in the present. An expert gaslighter can even drive his or her victim to suicide. Then there's a section about gaslighting conversations. I'm not going to be going over that right now, but you can check it out in the article below. I'll leave a link in the description box. I'm going to talk briefly about healing from gaslighting. Healing from gaslighting takes time and support. It requires distance and space from the abuser, no contact or low contact from the abuser, in order to reconnect to your reality and get grounded in what you felt, experienced, and perceived. Here are some tips to get started. Make redirecting, anchoring statements when you find yourself romanticizing your abuser or dismissing an abusive incident. the good news is that repetition can go the other way, right? The repetition of malignant falsehoods may convince you to warp your own reality and distrust yourself, but the repetition of the truth can help you to remember what the truth actually is. So create anchoring statements that help redirect you to the reality of what you experienced. And keep a list or a document of evidence, of factual evidence that you have gathered. Keep documentation of what's going on, right? Whatever you have, screenshots of text messages, voicemails, phone calls, keep that around you so that whenever you are tempted to feed into the doubt that the abuser has fed you, you instead anchor yourself back to what really happened. You remember, oh, they called me at this time, they texted me this, they said this, and journal about it, right? Journaling can really help to refocus you on your own reality rather than the reality that the abuser has presented to you. Seek self-validation and let go of your need to gain validation from the abuser. Abusive people are far too invested in their own agendas to ever validate reality, right? A lot of abusers will never tell you the truth unless it serves them. So just remember that and keep remembering that. If they still deny what they did or said, that does not mean that you're wrong. It simply means that they're denying what they did or said because they have an agenda. And remembering that agenda can help you to ground yourself in the reality of the abuser and their character. And that's why no contact is so important, because you can get that necessary distance from your abuser to regroup and emerge from this warped reality, this fog that they've created around you. And this fog can be so malicious because it affects you not only mentally and emotionally and psychologically, but also physically. You're completely exhausted, and you are so exhausted from analyzing everything, trying to understand why this abuser says something that's not true, and trying to reconcile that with your own reality, that you get distracted and you start wondering, am I really perceiving everything correctly, when in fact you are, but you're too exhausted to really ground yourself. Consult trusted outsiders to do some much needed reality testing. In the movie Gaslight, it is only when an inspector confirms that the gaslights are indeed flickering to the gaslighted wife, Paula, that she realizes that she was right all along. Find your own inspectors, right? Find the mental health professional who's trauma-informed, knowledgeable about malignant narcissism, and understands the dynamics of covert violence. This is so important, because if you have a therapist who actually gaslights you further, unintentionally or intentionally, then you're just going to become re-traumatized. You need someone who understands gaslighting. You need someone who understands psychological violence. You need someone who understands malignant narcissism and what it means to be a sociopath, because otherwise they're going to make statements like, well, maybe he or she didn't intend to do this. Maybe he or she was just confused. Maybe he or she is misunderstanding things. Maybe you're misunderstanding things. And when, they start making gaslighting statements of their own, ooh, that's gonna just further the gaslighting effect, and you don't want that. So when you're with this outsider, this trusted inspector, describe what you felt, heard, witnessed, and have them revalidate that reality for you. Anchor yourself, and regaining your voice in the set, and having a witness to really witness what you're going through, what you've experienced, can really be essential to the healing journey. Write your story and bring it into the context of longer-term behavioral patterns. So when we are being gaslighted, we often get focused on one thing. We get focused on one incident. But when we bring it into the context of the narcissist's larger-than-life pathological behavior, and we study their patterns, we realize, no, this one incident is part of a larger pattern that describes their hardwired behavior, that describes their personality disorder. And when we do that, we start to separate the reality of our experiences from the claims of the abuser, the distorted claims of the abuser. For example, a journal entry might look like the following. Tom calls me a really terrible name today, even though I'd asked him multiple times to stop calling me that. It made me feel so degraded and small when he did it again without apologies. When I called him out, he insisted that I was being hypersensitive or imagining things. But the reality is, I've asked him several times to stop, and he's disrespecting my wishes every time. He continues to violate me, and he continues to disregard my feelings. It seems my feelings don't matter to him at all. So this narrates the experience without giving into the gaslighting attempts of the abuser. It reframes the experience to recall the victim's feelings during the interactions and address what rights were violated. And it also includes a mention of the pattern of behavior that's been witnessed all along. Tom, as the victim notes, has a habit of disrespecting her even when she has addressed the name calling and the fact that it makes her uncomfortable. So the victim of gaslighting, by narrating her experience in this manner, is then able to draw a conclusion based on the pattern of behavior that she sees reoccurring, and seeing it as a fact rather than dismissing it as an isolated incident. This is a fact of his disorder. This is the fact of his pathological behavior. This is part of his pattern. So, you know, once you start recognizing the patterns, you start to become even more convinced of the reality and the accuracy of your truth. This helps you to relieve some of the cognitive dissonance, and you can reaffirm your reality and begin to trust yourself again. I hope the excerpts that I've shared from this article have helped you. Have you been the victim of gaslighting from a malignant narcissist, whether it be a garden variety narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath? Please let me know your most absurd claims that you've heard from abusers. I'd really love to hear your stories, and I'm sure it'll help other victims who've also been gaslighted and have been thrust into the mental fog that creates. If you want to read the entire article, I will leave a link in the description below to the article and thought catalog, and I hope to talk to you guys soon. Until next time, take care. Be sure to check out my #1 best-selling book on personality disorders, Becoming the Narcissist Nightmare: How to Devalue and Discard the Narcissist While Supplying Yourself, a #1 bestseller in personality disorders. Also, be sure to check out my book, Power: Surviving and Thriving After Narcissistic Abuse, a #1 bestseller in applied psychology. And as part of a special book promotion, which is available for a limited amount of time, my poetry collection for survivors is 90% off. You can get the paperback copy for 90% off if you use the promo code LIGHT on shopcatalog.com/SheWhoDestroysTheLight. Use dashes in the title. I'll leave a link in the description box below. I'll talk to you guys soon, and until next time, take care.